A very warm welcome to you all this evening. I'm Tom Asher. I'm representing Columbia World Projects. I'm going to keep these remarks very brief because we have a really remarkable panel this evening, and I want to save all the time for them. Columbia World Projects, which is hosting this event, along with a number of institutions I'll name in a minute, is an initiative that builds and sustains connections across worlds of policy, research, and practice. And we're premised on the idea that not only does research born out of the university need to attain greater influence and wider reach and to shape policies and the work of practitioners, but also that the best thinking from outside the university needs to start to inform our understanding of how changes in policy and practice can be affected. This year, we've been animated by almost a singular concern for how to build civic culture. And if we're to think constructively about how to improve the political culture of democracy in the 21st century, and the social structures that are needed to sustain it, we'll need to think deeply about how to design a set of digital spaces that take a very different form from those that we have today. It is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. So let me start with Audrey Tang, who served as Taiwan's first digital minister from 2016 to 2024. She is celebrated, I mean really celebrated, as you probably all know, for pioneering efforts in digital democracy. She was named one of Time's 100 most influential people in AI, and Tang was instrumental in shaping Taiwan's internationally acclaimed COVID-19 response and safeguarding the 2024 presidential and legislative elections from foreign cyber interference. Tang is now focused on broadening her vision, of plurality, technology for collaborative diversity to inspire global audiences. Tang's recently published book, Plurality, The Future of Collaborative Technology and Democracy, describes this vision in depth, and we'll hear, I'm sure, about a fair amount of that tonight. Remarkably, she began her career not in government, but as a hacker and as an activist who hacked government and reshaped political outcomes and possibilities in the process. I'm certain we'll hear a bit more about that. And Audrey is joined by Eli Pariser. Eli is the co-founder and co-director of New Public, a community and experimentation hub for digital public spaces. He's been an author, activist, and entrepreneur focused on how to make technology and the media serve democracy. In 2004, at the very ripe age of 23, he became executive director of MoveOn.org, where he helped pioneer the practices of online citizen engagement that we continue to use today. And in 2006, he founded Avaaz, the world's largest citizens organization. His best-selling book in 2011, The Filter Bubble, introduced a term that we now use ubiquitously. We'll hear, I'm sure, about some of that work. But he also founded Upworthy, the media startup that he co-founded in 2012, which reached hundreds of millions of visitors with civically important content. And now today at New Public, his work is focused on bringing together community entrepreneurs, researchers, engineers, and designers to envision, architect, and scale digital public spaces. And this conversation will be moderated by another remarkable person in our midst, Camille François. She is an associate professor of practice at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. She specializes in how organized actors use digital technologies to harm society and individuals. Her work to understand and mitigate digital harm spans from cyber conflict to online harassment. She has advised governments and parliamentarian committees on both sides of the Atlantic. She was previously senior director for trust and safety at Niantic, a pioneering augmented reality and gaming company, and she was CIO at Graphica, a cybersecurity company focused on detecting disinformation networks. This event, and I'm going to hand it over to you in 30 seconds, has been co-sponsored by a number of really fantastic organizations this evening. Among them is All Tech is Human, the Data Science Institute here at Columbia University, and the Institute for Global Politics at the School of International and Public Affairs, commonly known, as you all know, as SIPA. So please, take us from here.
Thank you so much, Tom.
I know it's always annoying when the speakers are talking about how great the other people are, but I just have to say, like, this really is an honor. I feel like, Audrey, your work has been just so inspiring to me for so long, and it's awesome to get to think together. And Camille, I feel like you really helped me and lots of other people understand what was happening on the internet at a really critical time. So
we're glad we're here. We're glad you were here.
Yeah.
This is going to be a fun Monday.
Yes. I was the weird 14-year-old who woke up one morning and said to my mom, and this is a true story, like, I think what I want to be when I grow up is whatever is exactly halfway between being like a nonprofit person and a .com CEO. And that basically was because I had this sense that the internet was something really powerful and exciting, but that unless it was enlisted in the project of democracy and the project of making a better society, I wasn't convinced that it was going to go that well. And that's kind of been the question and the through line for me from the very beginning. It was, how do we take this like magical, amazing thing and put it in the service of our highest values and the things that we care about the most? And so I was lucky enough to start something rolling that folded into Move On, that became this incredible like digitally aided citizens movement in my 20s, and got to really see, I just to spend a moment on that. Basically, after the September 11th terrorist attacks, I was 19, I think, and sitting in my apartment and thinking about how this was like a big moment in history and things could go either way, and put up a kind of petition for multilateralism and sent it to a few friends. And all of a sudden had like 500.
At 19, your response was to put a petition for multilateralism?
Yeah.
Were you a CPAS student?
I mean, we already covered that I was a nerd. I was like 14, I was a nerd. 19, I was a nerd. No, I felt like, this was a moment where something had to happen. But I was also like just out of college and like had no idea what to do. And anyway, it sort of went viral. All of a sudden I was in touch with people in 170 countries. And for me, that was like that moment of, here I am, a person with no resources and no money and no name and no nothing. And all of a sudden you can activate this network of people and do something really amazing.
Globally.
Yeah. And so that's like always stayed with me as what's exciting about this medium. But anyway, got involved with Move On and got to see a bunch of the really like amazing stuff that this facilitated. But as I was spending more time looking at it, I think I lost some of my naive kind of techno-determinist idea that this was naturally going to be good for democracy, that there was inherent, tendencies in the technology, which was a fun thing we used to think about at that time, that this was just inherently going to turn out well. So, I think the filter bubble and the work that I've been doing since then has really been trying to figure out.
And just for those who want to rehear it again,
Okay.
The one-line definition of the filter bubble.
So this is like a way of understanding the personal universe of information that's produced for you by social media, by the other algorithmic filters around you. And
It was a great book, and this is a much better summary than the ChatGPT summary of this very famous book. So thank you.
Thank you. And I'll just say, like, because I was realizing it makes me feel very old, and I am very old now. But that was 15 years ago that I was doing that thinking, and at that time, that was still kind of in the height of. Social media is going to be a boon to people power everywhere, and it's just naturally going to turn the world into a better place. And I think the filter bubble was kind of one of a number of early people who were kind of saying like,
maybe not,
yeah. Like, and what about all the concentration of power that's happening, and what about the incentives behind that concentration of power and what algorithms are wanting to produce for people. So, but it was lonely at that time. Yeah. And one of the things that's been so amazing now and I know folks are here from All Tech is Human and all these other places, is like, there's a whole community of us who recognize that this thing isn't going to happen on its own, and that we have to build the kind of internet architecture that we want if we want it to serve people well. And that's been it's been a hard part of the last 15 years, but it's a really beautiful thing about the moment that we're in, and also the work that Audrey's been doing.
I think, Audrey, this is where you come in. So, just for starters, nobody's old here.
Okay.
But I have met Audrey more than 15 years ago. And I remember that because I was so excited to meet this fantastic open source hacker. And then a few weeks after that, maybe a month, I hear back from Audrey and she's occupying her parliament. I'm like, wow, that's a bold move.
Non-violently.
Bold move. And then shortly after that, I hear back from Audrey again, and she's a minister, very official government capability. I believe now you're also an ambassador.
Yes, I'm now cyber ambassador.
Yeah, and so I was like, well, that's really very encouraging for the open source hacker young kid nerds that you can actually occupy a parliament, and the story ends well and ends you with you being the government. It's a remarkable and very encouraging trajectory. Audrey, talk to us a little bit about that trajectory. And I love the fact that years after, you're still always hacking on something, and that you've sort of kept this sort of dedication to always being hacking on something. So tell us about this arc and tell us about what you're hacking on right now.
Okay, I'm hacking right now to bring zero knowledge proofs to Blue Sky so that we can prove that we're a citizen of a certain city without revealing this whole real ID thing. And I can go on, but back to 2014. Yeah. So in 2014, I was working with a bunch of fellow open source hackers on turning microblogging into something that is useful for enterprise. The company was called Social Text, and we worked on something that looks very much like Twitter, but without the personalized isolation, aka filter bubble mechanisms, but rather focusing on the balancing and the bridging algorithms, meaning that you want something that brings a common experience to your team, and you also want to know other silos in your larger organization. And so we were designing kind of like the polar opposite of the personalized isolation. And then I remember on this internal microblogging platform called Signals, actually unrelated to Meredith. And so I was just typing, and then I heard from this channel, I think it was IRC back then, that there's a bunch of people occupying the streets around the parliament because the parliament was fast tracking a trade deal with Beijing without substantial deliberation, and people was asking whether anyone can help to support the internet for live streaming. And it just so happens that I know something about live streaming, so that I typed on this internal work tool to my colleagues in Silicon Valley saying, okay, I have to leave now, democracy needs me. And so I just brought this very long, like 300 meters Ethernet cable and set up live streaming and internet connection. And that proved to be important because at that night, people broke into the parliament, and with no police, like people was very surprised that they could get into it. And we documented this whole process. And so the next morning, when the mainstream media tried to paint us as, violent gangsters and whatever, we have the live stream to prove that it's not the case. And so when the police then surrounded the occupied place, the people watching the live stream counter-surrounded the police so that they would not escalate. And so 3 weeks into that Occupy, every day we help the live streaming so that you can go to one corner in the occupied street corner, and you can find a mini citizens assembly of people talking about one particular aspect. Maybe it's about the 4G infrastructure of Huawei and ZTE, and maybe it's about the labor laws, maybe it's about environmental rights and things like that. And every day it converged a little bit more, and we read to the plenary what was agreed on that particular day with facilitated conversation. And at the end of the 3 weeks, it's like, the Speaker of the Parliament, Wang Jinping, simply say, okay, these people have a point. I agree with all of them. And so it was one of very rare Occupy that ended up with basically a Speaker of the Parliament saying, okay, now go home because we agree with you. And so at the end of that year, we, the civic activists, was hired as reverse mentors, like young advisors to the cabinet. So the people under 35 now advise the people over 35 in the cabinet in the art of broad listening, that is to say the reverse of broadcasting. And they really had to do that because that year the trust from our citizen to our democratic elected government was at 9%. And Taiwan was 23 million people, still is. And so that means anything the government says, 20 million people are automatically against them. And so they really need to work out some way to break the filter bubble of personalized isolation and shared outrage and learn something about, bridging and balancing and how to broad listen so that people's common ideas can actually inform policy making and agenda setting. And so we work on that for 6 years. And by 2020 already, the trust level became like 73% or something. So a very large increase over 6 years.
And so you brought these methods into government and to sort of like demonstrate that there is no challenge too big for you. When AI came in and we all got worried about it, you were like, no, actually, I believe and will demonstrate that AI can help participatory technology in the service of government. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you manage that?
Sure. And that's really interesting because since the 2014 Occupy, we've never called ourselves protesters because protesters are against something only. We call ourselves demonstrators, as in demoing something, right? Showing something new. And that demonstration started, of course, with this analog, physical citizens' assembly. But very quickly, people discovered actually the focused conversation method, the dynamic facilitation, the open space technology. These are proven social technologies that work as well online as offline. And so the next year, 2015, when Uber came to Taiwan and there was a lot of polarization, if you look at social media, then you would think that the extractive gig economy or this sharing, pooling economy, very environmental friendly. So these are like irreconcilable. But we used AI at the time, a bridging system called Polis. It's an open source project, and ask all the Uber drivers, taxi drivers, passengers, and so on to go online and share their common ideas and feelings, and actually first to share facts. So the share facts gets upvoted or downvoted, but there's no reply button, so no room for trolls to grow. And most importantly, we show people exactly where the divisions are. People can literally see as they vote on each other's ideas and feelings where their avatar go on the 4 main groups, main clusters. And the great thing is that once people saw this kind of group selfie, this common picture, it reduced polarization like the second they saw this image, because it's not as bad as they thought it was. And we then said anybody can propose those bridging ideas. For example, undercutting existing meters is very bad, but surge pricing is fine. Or that if Uber is allowed to operate in urban areas, then the rural co-ops need the same license, so on and so forth. Very eclectic, nuanced ideas. And so only these ideas that cut across all the 3 or 4 different clusters get agenda setting power, and we consider them for our lawmaking. And so after 3 weeks, again, unsurprisingly, the shared facts and then shared feelings and then shared ideas. And finally, we crowdsourced this bunch of like 9 recommendations, which then we said, yeah, that's a great idea. And so we legalized Uber as a taxi fleet in Taiwan with the help of the cooperatives and so on. So everybody wins. And so I think that the main takeaway from this example is that the polarization mostly happens in people's heads. If you do show people an actual division, it's almost never as great as what people's mind are. And so I think once we get this common picture, then we can talk about actual bridging across the different groups.
What I find absolutely remarkable about that story, Audrey, is that it's not a theory, it's a case study for something that has literally happened at scale. So I would encourage you all to read Audrey's latest book, Plurality, which is as remarkable for its content. You're going to find a lot of similar sort of like case studies for how this was done in practice, but it's also remarkable for its format. You can, of course, download the book in a wide variety of format, and you can contribute back to it. With that, let us talk a little bit about the nominal topic of our conversation, which is how do we reshape social media for the public good? And I think as we ask that, a lot of us think to that weird moment that we seem to be in, particularly when it comes to sort of classic social media platforms. I think you both highlighted that you've been at these sort of alternative models for many, many years now, but it's taken a minute to sort of reach global consciousness. And now it's been interesting to see over the past few weeks, over the past few months, people leaving Twitter, now X, in droves and going on other alternative social media platforms. And for many, it's been a moment of sort of rethinking, okay, if we're saying goodbye to Twitter at a moment where Facebook is also no longer where it used to be in terms of usage, are we sort of saying goodbye to that moment of sort of global public square that we all thought Twitter was really sort of capturing? And I like you both being so precise with words. Audrey, I like when you say we're not protesters, we're a demonstrator in the original hacker way of demo. I believe, Eli, that you also have a few feelings on this sort of global public square idea. You started chipping away at it with the filter bubble. But talk to us about, that idea. Were we enamored with a fantasy of a global public square, that very large platform we're going to service? Is that still in the cards for us? Is that desirable? Like, where are we heading to? Where are we coming back from?
Yeah, so it drives me crazy. And for a couple reasons. And so part of it is the sense of a global space, and part is the public. So if we can talk about the global space for a moment, there is not conceptually or literally such a thing as a global space. That's not a thing that exists. And if you're wondering, if you think that Twitter or you think that Facebook is that, consider how often you see content in a different language than your own in that space. If it's almost never, that's because you're not actually occupying a global space. You're occupying a much smaller space that is defined through the lens of that algorithm. So I think it's important to say, and what's more, even just if you think literally and physically, there is no space that 3 billion people could occupy, or 5 billion people could occupy, or 7 billion people could occupy. That would become something other than one place. And so I think that's important, because what town squares are spaces that are situated in a particular place and a particular locality with particular people. And that's part of how we do workable publicness, is not the universal thing. I think the second...
So why did we inherit that idea, though? Was it social, media Silicon Valley marketing? Because it was definitely in the air, right? Where was it coming from?
I think partly it's that when you look at the late, the internet in the late 70s and the early 80s, it kind of was, you could have a global village, because it was just a village-sized group of people who were on the internet, period, right?
Got it.
And so, you could get everyone on the node at the well or wherever it was, and that just wasn't that many people, and you had certain things that you could do at that kind of scale of people. Now we're at this totally different scale, and my deep belief is that we're reaching the end of the road for this era of social media that imagines that you can have a single algorithm that is governed centrally, that's going to work for billions of people and hundreds of millions of communities and thousands of different languages and cultures. That's ridiculous. That's obviously on its face not something that works, and I think we're living through that. And so
can you give us a few examples of what it took for us to realize that this was actually not a great idea and not going to work?
Well, I think part of it is the sense of precarity and opaqueness and authoritarianism by design that exists in a lot of the current systems. And I'm saying that in the sense of if your Twitter account gets turned off, if your Instagram account gets turned off, if your TikTok account gets turned off, there's no one to appeal to, there's no one to talk to, there's nothing that you can do. That's a decision that's happening from on high, that's totally opaque, that you have no power in. And that's a feeling that now that these places are important to our lives, that I think a lot of people experience. So I think that's one way that it plays out, is just that sense of maybe there are rules. I have no idea what they are. I have no idea who's enforcing them. I have no idea what to do about them. But they're not fair, and they're not even, and they affect people's lives deeply.
Yeah. So you said you had two problems with the idea of a global public square.
Right. So I think the other piece is publicness, which is just a billionaire can't buy your town square. That's not a thing that is possible to do.
No idea what you might be referring to.
So it isn't a public infrastructure, really, and it's maybe it's equivalent to the way that malls over time became the town the main street for towns. That was true in a certain sense. It meant something in people's lives, but at the end of the day, the mall is a private company owned by someone who can kick you out if they don't like what you're saying. And that's what we've decided. That's the way that we've decided to structure the current internet.
So the global public square with neither global nor public.
Right, exactly. And it's not square. So really, we've got like a trifactor.
So we were really wrong.
But like, I think that opens up a place to like think differently about this. And I guess what I draw inspiration from is, one of the things that I actually really love the most about America as a country is the history of innovating in public infrastructure and public space. And Ethan Zuckerman, who some of us, who's been inspiring to me as a scholar in this space, has a whole story that he tells about Ben Franklin and the early postal service. So the postal service was really deliberately architected as a way of subsidizing the exchange of information in this bridging kind of way. Exactly what Audrey is talking about. And it was this brilliant scheme. And if you look at the United States government at the turn of the 1800s, it can reasonably be described as a very large post office with a small military attached. There were way more people working for the postal service than working for the military in the United States. That was how important the public information infrastructure was to the idea of this country from the very beginning. And since then, we've been at the forefront of inventing all sorts of kinds of public infrastructures and spaces, whether it's libraries, public libraries, whether it's public schools and secondary education. And, some of these things, it's also classically American to say that we invented things that actually also happened elsewhere. But
I wasn't going to point that, but yes, that might be a concern.
But the point is that we have this real tradition of like deciding to structure our public spaces and our public goods in service of these values of democracy. And we've lost that a bit. But I think that's the piece that we can channel. That's a muscle that we have that we can bring back to this question of how to structure the internet. So for me, the big question is, how do we build digital public spaces that do some of these critical community building and informational functions that will never happen? It's like if you think about a bookstore and a library, a bookstore just is never going to do the jobs that a library is going to do. It's not because bookstores are bad necessarily. It's because the business model, the incentive structure around a bookstore is different than a public institution like a library. So we need both, and we need both in the digital realm too. And that's what New Public, which I'm co-leading now, is trying to kind of to build. And that's a small part of kind of this broader digital public square that I think needs to be reconsidered.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about like how you are both building and inventing and reinventing those online, now I don't want to say public anymore, those online shared spaces that maybe are more aligned by design with public interest and where we want to be online. And you both have different approaches to sort of like reclaiming different parts. Eli, we talked about this. I'm not gonna, as the French person on the panel, I'm not going to say anything about, French Revolution having a few ideas to contribute on how we build public infrastructure. I will say though, the French have been extraordinarily centralized about it. It's all about centralization. And I think one of the fascinating things that you're doing is sort of thinking about localizing our online spaces. And what does it look like to sort of like break away from those idea, the fantasy that you discussed of a global public square towards online spaces that are properly local and that might better reflect the type of online communities that we want to engage in and that might be actually more in line with public interest. So talk to us a little bit about this sort of local aspect of it. And then Audrey, we'll come back to you to sort of like retake a more global perspective and think about what it means to be global, but maybe in a different way from a different infrastructural standpoint. So local first and then
open protocols.
Yeah, we'll talk about protocols. Eli, take us local.
So Nathan Schneider, who's another great scholar in the space, has a book called Governable Spaces. And it's a great book, but I also just love that title as a kind of aspiration. Like, what kinds of spaces are governable and are self-governable? And I guess my belief, as you're hearing, is that at a certain scale, it's really hard to self-govern. And so part of what interests me about looking at geographically local places is that you're at a scale that's governable, and you also have the benefit of working with communities that already have some trust and some shared connection. And for me, as someone who is concerned about democracy in America right now, this is a place where there's a real opportunity to innovate, because I think people's connection to their community and to the place that they're in is something that actually brings people together across some of the cleavages and divides and polarization that we have. And I've always believed that people onboard onto democracy kind of at an experiential local level. Like it's not about like learning about some governance system in a textbook. It's like you do stuff with other people who aren't like you, and it works and it's good. And that's like fundamentally the thing that convinces people that this is better than someone coming in and telling everyone what to do. And so we need to create spaces that enable that. And that's something that I think is going to be more possible at a local level, where the problems are more tractable than kind of at a federal level. And I say this as someone who ran a big organization that was campaigning on federal issues. But I kind of look back at that and I go like, if you're trying to influence, let's say, Joe Manchin in the Senate, like how many 100 million people, you can have 100 million people pushing on that. And at the end of the day, it's one guy's ideas, and it's where he ends up. That's a fundamentally disempowering experience. But if you try to get people together to do something about the dog park or do something about this local school, that's a place where actually you can do something, and that creates a positive feedback loop. Instead of being alienated and feeling powerless, you feel powerful, and you're connecting with other people to do something. And the people you're connecting with don't have to be people you agree with on everything to solve like the problem with the dog park. So I think there's a real opportunity there from a both a network design standpoint and from a democratic standpoint.
We'll come back to the network design point, because I think what I'm hearing you say is that you design spaces differently when they're optimized for local conversation than versus when they're a fantasy of a global public square.
Yeah.
Audrey, we had this conversation about federated social media networks, and in your traditional let's be precise about what we're trying to do here way, you said, is this federation really the right metaphor here? And is this media that we're talking about? And so we landed on, let's discuss federated social spaces, right?
Yeah, or just federated social networks.
The Fediverse.
Yeah, the Fediverse.
Talk to us a little bit about like what is this Fediverse idea, and how that can sort of be a bridge between the local spaces and the aspiration to do that on a global or almost global scale.
Certainly. So I think one of the key design principle in the early internet is this idea of protocols. That is to say, regardless of which email application you use, maybe you use Gmail, maybe I use Proton, it doesn't matter. You can send email to me. I can reply to your email. I don't even know what your email server is, right? And you can switch at any given time. And once you switch, you don't lose all your emails, nor do you lose the ability to reply to your previous threads. And this is taken as kind of given the end-to-end principle, meaning that the internet itself is not opinionated on which email applications to use, but it is quite opinionated on what standard protocol in order to transmit email. So a little bit like the postal office example, it has to be a transparent, interoperable network. Or if you have tried podcasts, you use the RSS or ATOM, those protocols that says, if you post on, say, Spotify, it doesn't matter which application people used to listen to you. Maybe they use iTunes or whatever. So again, it doesn't matter. The client and the server, the peer and the other peers can use completely different designs, algorithms, and so on. And it gives to the permissionless innovation idea, which means that if I don't like how the things are working, I can do something new, do something better. And I don't have to convince everybody else on the internet. As long as I convince one or two other people, then we form a new small network that can still talk to the old world using the existing protocols. And so in a sense, Facebook or TikTok are an exception to this internet rule. If you post on TikTok, there is really no other way to curate TikTok content than, well, TikTok. And the same goes for Facebook. And so the main idea here is that if we make sure that the social networks formed locally sometimes have some way to push out the kind of feeds that other people can subscribe to without getting trapped into a single centralized opaque decision making, then we can get meaningful discussions going on between two local groups. And one of the first people to do that, building upon the RSS example, is the Mastodon people with the Activity Pub protocol. But nowadays, there are many other protocols. For example, the AD protocol, the Blue Sky protocol, basically takes a different view. Instead of one small pod here, one small pod there, transmitting messages, federating among themselves, the Blue Sky idea is that so you first have this global namespace so that you can all post on, but then you can create like subreddits or different views, different gated communities that say, okay, only these people, I am curating it into my feed and so on. So it's a different view. It's more like a wide web where everybody can set up their own site. There's this global index, the search engine that indexes everything. And then you specialize with your views, with your blog web rings. I don't know what people here remember those. So you can curate your own view on the entire web. But whether it is the view of, small pods sending messages across or a kind of indexed view with people creating their own experiences, the same thing is that it's interoperable, it's transparent, so that even if your content gets taken down somewhere, your followers doesn't actually just lose those content. You can migrate with your social graph somewhere else. And that is the main difference versus the centralized social media of today.
Yeah, and I think by doing that, Audrey, you're helping us do something that's extraordinarily important right now, which is a lot of our conversations on social media are dominated by conversations on freedom of speech. And that is freedom to decide what you can and cannot post online. So it's a way to think about freedom that's very stuck at the content level. And I think, Audrey, what you're doing for us is to think about freedom at the infrastructure level, right? The freedom to leave a social network and take all of your content with you and post it elsewhere. The freedom to study, that's so important in the open source movement, right? The freedom to look at the code and say, oh, I understand which rules are applied on the social network. I understand why this post is being seen in this way or why that post is taken down. And to your last point, right, the very important freedom to tweak, fork, make your own, right? And take sort of a version and make your own alternative version of what that social media infrastructure can be. I think this is how we sort of like reinvent those alternative spaces that hopefully are, better aligned with public interest, right? I want to talk about what you both need to sort of continue building these visions, right? Sometimes we think that public interest technology is a little bit of a pipe dream, but we also forget that it's been built into the fabric of how we use the web. You both talked about how much this is an old idea. This is how the internet came to be. And still today, for instance, I use Firefox for my browser. It's an open source browser that's maintained by a foundation, the Mozilla Foundation. When I communicate with my friends, I use Signal. You talked about Signal. It's a very widely used protocol, same encryption protocol that's used by WhatsApp, but Signal is maintained by a nonprofit. And then we can go on and on, right? Wikimedia is also public interest technology that's maintained by a nonprofit. And as you're bringing these ideas into what we call the social media spaces or those sort of online conversation spaces that are more local and more federated, what are the pieces that you want to flag for everybody saying, we need that, we need to keep our focus on this, and we have momentum to sort of bring about these new alternative spaces?
Well, if I can just zoom out slightly, and then I'll come back to that. We just had this election here, and I guess, I was someone, we're a nonpartisan organization, but I voted for Kamala Harris. And I've been processing and thinking about what the election meant. And I think one of the things that it was about, it turned out, was a set of questions about, do these institutions, are they good or not good? And if you thought they were good, then you were supposed to vote for Harris. And if you thought they were bad, then you were supposed to vote for Trump. And it was kind of, they're okay or burn them down. And without getting into, this isn't a critique of her campaign, but just, I think that's an unsatisfying set of choices, because the reality is that the institutions that we have are not upgraded, are not sufficient for the kinds of lives we lead for existing into the 21st century. And so I guess to this question of like, what do we need? I think this is a moment for really radical imagination and experimentation to try to figure out, if you believe like me that they shouldn't just be torn down, but that they need to be dramatically upgraded, that we need whole new ways of thinking about how to engage people in institutions and in the democratic process that are different. And that to me is like scary, but also very exciting, because there's a lot of room for the building of new things and new ideas in this moment.
It's a hacker moment again.
It's
like we get to tweak and upgrade and fork the institutions.
Yeah.
And hopefully merge.
So I think the ideas and the entrepreneurialism and the public entrepreneurialism isn't just what I need, but I think is what we all need in order to make this thing work. I think that's one thing. I think more tangibly, if you're excited about sort of hacking on some local stuff, we need help with that too. And that could mean, I think there are a bunch of ways to get into that. Some of it is more technical, but some of it is actually these are fundamentally socio-technical problems. They're problems that involve like being really wise and thoughtful about how people come together and how to have technology support that. And so I think we need a lot of people who are really brilliant about community and about digital community as well. One of the things that we've learned as we've looked at the existing digital spaces and especially local spaces is that often they depend on like what we call a steward, a person who's a volunteer who puts in a whole bunch of love and care and time to make something work.
Is that like a moderator, for instance, in some context?
Exactly, yeah. And but moderator suggests that what they're doing is moderating. And this is like a lot more. Like in some ways, I think it's the same error that people make when they look at librarians and they're like, oh, that's the person who, knows the Dewey Decimal System. And it's like, well, yeah, but they're also the person who's figuring out how to help, the person who's experiencing homelessness over here and help this young family do something over here and fill out federal forms. There's all this like social knowledge that actually happens in a great librarian that's not just
so moderators is a misnomer too.
Yeah, so I think the point is, if you want to be involved in creating some of the new forms of being together online, you can contribute technically, but you can also contribute socially, and that social contribution is as important as the technical contribution, because if I listen to what you were up to in the movement that you spoke about, if I think about my movement work with Move On, so much of it was about people entrepreneurialism meeting tech entrepreneurialism, and that's the kind of ethos I think we need to solve these kinds of problems.
I love that. That's great. Audrey.
Yeah. So back to the reshaping social media for the public good point. I think so. I'm part of the Project Liberty, and part of the idea of Project Liberty is that we can evaluate any social media with three criteria. That's voice, choice, and stake. Voice meaning whether your input has a meaningful opportunity to change how the social media works, whether you can curate your own feeds, whether you can curate your own sub-communities, and that is the voice part. And there's also the choice part. Like if you're really not happy of how things are going, can you take your social graph, your followers, and so on, and all your content, and move on to a different system where your voice is more valued? And finally, a stake, meaning that if this social media business model have some way to make money, for example, from sponsored content or from advertisement and so on, is there a way to track the provenance of that value and whether you're rewarded for that value provided instead of being the product? And so my suggestion would be simply think about these three things as you're posting anything on any social media system, whether it is a open protocol that would enable a choice, whether it has a governance structure that would include your voice, and whether if there is a kind of advertisement or monetization or subscription or whatever model, are you comfortable with that business model? So I'm not saying, post to Blue Sky or post to Mastodon or use only Firefox and Signal, although I use them too, but rather to evaluate the choices you make, because everything is a network effect. The more people are insisting on those three values, the more these three values are going to be popular, and therefore more people insisting on them.
I think that's a great sort of Columbia reminder as a university that's deeply committed to interdisciplinarity, that engineering is also deeply interdisciplinary. And this is how we should think about the fabric of tech around us, right? These infrastructure choices, I think when we listen to you speak, we hear the political theory, we hear the economic theory. And when we think about rebuilding those alternative online spaces, we hear, to your point, Eli, the need to be doing this together, to go about it with a wide set of skill set and to go about it in a profoundly interdisciplinary way. I want to turn to questions. We've gotten a few amazing questions in writing. I'll pick two, and then I want to make sure that we get some questions in the room too. All right. First one is a fun trivia question on the history of the internet. It's a tough one. It comes from Ryu Ichiro from Colombia. And the question is, when was the healthiest time for the internet ever? And is the current problem of social media due to its immature and unsophisticated algorithm, or is it a more innate structural problem?
Is it just immature or actually on the wrong track?
Yes. Is it too young or is it too wrong?
Well, I would say maybe before precision advertisements was invented. So that would be like mid 1990s-ish, right? And so back then, the protocols are open and there's no perverse incentives to create this curated, personalized isolation, right? I think once the personal precision advertisement model was discovered, even before social media uses those advertisements, you start seeing fragmentation in people's experience and therefore behaviors. And you do see this polarization and things like that starting. And then, of course, social media and then the mobile phone all added to that very, very specifically curated isolation. If we had instead at that point something like the shared subscription model or paying for advertisement to create common experiences instead of isolated experiences, things would probably have gone very differently.
Eli, when did we go off the rails? What was the original sin? Is it technical? Is it political? Is it economic? All of the above.
Yeah, I mean, I think so, if you think back to Usenet, there were some great things that happened on Usenet, and there were some terrible things that happened on Usenet. And that's, to some degree, that's the nature of human systems, right? That you'll have some people who are wanting to do great things and people who are wanting to do really awful things. I think I do sort of see a juncture point in chasing scale, and especially chasing economic scale, as a kind of like turning point for the web. And I think that just shoved us into a set of systems that were inherently reductive, because when you're building a social media platform, you literally reduce everything to a handful of metrics that you're trying to drive up and to the right. That's the method of blitz scaling, is to take something and figure out what the key metrics are and how do we get that to be as big as possible. And the diversity and beauty of human life does not reduce to a few key metrics. Like, that's just not how we work. And so there's something that gets lost in that like compression process to me, and that we all kind of experienced as being lost. One of the scholars of public spaces that I like to talk to often talks about how public spaces, have some friction built in. That's part of the nature. They're not the place that you necessarily always want to hang out or always want to be meeting up with other people or have your most intimate conversations. But that friction is part of the nature of the experience that brings something else with it. And I think when things get too frictionless, there's something that really gets lost as well. So, so I guess I also have in my mind a study that shows that with America, at least, if you ask people when America was great, it's always when they were 5 years old. So there's a tendency to like be nostalgic about whatever the version of the internet was that you came into it and think that that was the best. And then it all went downhill from there. And I think there's some truth to that too. Like things have always been hard and always been complicated. And I think the question now is, sort of where do we want things to go? So to the structural point, I do think we have some core structural problems. And one of those structural problems is that we've chosen, and I'm saying chosen because we could choose it a different way, to structure a lot of our information exchange through these private companies that are seeking to maximize their economic return. And I just think that was like a bad call. Okay, let's do it a different way.
So that's a great segue into the second question from Josephine at the Obama Foundation, who's asking, would it be possible for the state to build a social media network that's open source and safe instead of leaving it to private market actors?
Well, I guess I'll take that because I've allocated quite a bit of public infrastructure budget on these kind of systems. I think one of the main concerns that people have when the state runs something like this is that the state is not a credibly neutral entity when it comes to like political or ideological and things like that. And so what we always do, instead of the state running it, the state is just providing the continuous funding of it. The Taiwanese equivalent of Reddit, the PTT, has been for 27 years running now, open source, and it's sponsored, run by the National Taiwan University Student Club on the bulletin board systems. It's a very old idea. And then the idea of that is that it's at like twice arm's length from the state. The state provides educational funding to the NTU, of course, and the NTU supports all the costs basically for the PTT to run. But the administration is entirely open source. It's self-governed. It has this very like Reddit-like, subreddit-like idea without advertisers or shareholders. So there is no economic disincentive, right, for running a public square. They're all for public interest, and there's a natural rotation because as system administrators graduate, there's new system administrators coming to the school, right? So it keeps fresh. And so I always have that in mind when I design this kind of public interest infrastructural systems. We want to empower the lowest level of governments, that is to say, maybe a township, maybe a community union that manages their livings, a co-op or something like that. We want this kind of infrastructure that we, as the Taiwanese government, invest in our public code. So not just open source, but comes with a code of conduct for public sector and servants to use, and with good cybersecurity, testing, and all these standards. But at the end of the day, it is the town mayor, it is the city councilor. It is a very local level of government that can then configure it however they want and have a real conversation with their constituents. And so I think at that level, it's much harder to go wrong. And because it's open source, if you don't like how your voice is treated, you can have a choice. And we have seen the similar pattern in Japan with the Code for Japan brigades in all the cities. We have seen it in Finland with not just Helsinki, but many other places using Polis to have this agenda setting before their regular city council meetings, so that this consensus depolarized bridge is read before city councils. And again, none of this is a national state-run infrastructure, but the state does allocate money to make sure that it continues its maintenance and remains secure and safe and trusted.
So I'm hearing a yes with a lot of governance caveats, and maybe also a call for this is why you hire open source hackers into government.
Yes.
Eli, curious if you have thoughts on like what this looks like maybe at the local government level. Is that something that you've seen done successfully or that you would want to see?
Well, yeah, it's challenging because at least for now we have the First Amendment, and that makes a lot of the content moderation questions hard, right? Like if you have a government deciding that you can't say da-da-da on a government-owned network, that that runs you pretty squarely into a challenge. But I guess I think about, again, there are other local civic institutions that, as Audrey is saying, exist at arm's length, receive some government funding, but have this independence that allows them to do something that's an important information function for the community. And so I think there are lots of ways that you can innovate that don't require, that don't necessarily...
Universities, libraries.
Totally, yeah. That do something that's civically powerful. But I guess I would just say, like, maybe it's civic, not governmental.
Anna, can we take some questions from the room? Okay, great.
I'm gonna start back here.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you, and thank you so much for your remarks. So when I think about the social media public interest ecosystem, to me there tends to be two different camps and sides, and one of them is the one that I tend to associate with the both of you and maybe Frank McCourt and Project Liberty, which is to say that we need to take existing social media platforms and tweak them and internally change them for the better. Perhaps to open a lot of the structures and governance. And the other is a lot more pessimistic and skeptical, and would probably say, well, the incentives of social media companies are so deeply misaligned and entrenched that what we need to do, unless we can really fundamentally change the underlying incentives, our focus shouldn't be on tweaking social media platforms and their design, but rather on disincentivizing their use and on moving the public square away and perhaps more towards in-person community. And so my question is twofold. First of all, whether you would put yourself in that first camp, and if so, why? And why not accept the perspective of the second?
Can you introduce yourself too?
Oh, sure. Hi, I'm Nathan. I'm a senior at Columbia, and I work with Tristan Harris at the Center for Human Technology on a lot of these questions.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. I guess I don't think those are the only two paths, and I think I agree that tweaking the incentives of advertising companies that are fundamentally not built to be custodians of public discourse isn't going to get us very far. I agree with that part. I think some regulation is valuable, but I don't think it's sufficient. But I also I think we live in the 21st century, and while I'm a big fan of in-person conversation, I also think there are ways that can be exclusionary in a democratic context also. So I think a lot about, like, if you've ever tried to go to like a local planning board meeting, like, it is not a super welcoming, accessible, democratically vital space. So I think you can over-valorize what's happening in person. and the reality is that we probably need things that address people in both. We live lives where our physical selves and our digital selves are fundamentally entwined, and we need infrastructure that addresses all of that. But I guess, to me, the distinction I would make is with public purpose at the center rather than as an afterthought. And I think the design and everything that follows from putting public purpose at the center is qualitatively different from making adjustments to algorithms that are fundamentally don't have it at the center.
Audrey.
Yeah, and to continue on that, this public interest at the center, to me, and it's described in detail at the Plurality book, is to put shared experiences and social connections at the center. There are many designs of protocols that simply do not have that as a first-class object, as we in software engineering say. There is just no taxonomy for like people being the intersection of many overlapping groups, some of which local. But if you start with that thought, then the two sides are actually the same. One example, this March in Taiwan, we were fed up with the deepfakes of celebrities on Facebook selling crypto scams. But we also don't want the government to censor content. And so what we did is that we just sent SMS to text messages to 200,000 random numbers in Taiwan. And people who got those SMS, we just asked them to respond digitally. How do you think about the effects online and information integrity. But if you do have time, then we would like to invite you on an online conversation with 9 other people in a 10-person room for a whole day-ish deliberation about this very topic. And then 450 people were randomly chosen in a sortition. So it's stratified so that we know that these people are representative in terms of occupation, gender, place they live, and so on, the entire Taiwan. And then the 45 rooms just had this deliberation and facilitated by a robot. A language model synthesizes their ideas and finally co-created this very good rule that everybody, or at least more than 85% in every group, agreed. Now, is that a local community? Is that a social network? It's neither. It is a shared experience that we imbue them with rulemaking power that then creates communities and sub-communities around this conversation. And so I think one of the most important thing here is to share the agenda setting power, not just from the state, but also if you're a public benefit corporation, then share agenda setting power on the way your governance works and so on to the relevant public. And once that happens, then it becomes the shared social object. Then the local people, as well as this random people who are interested in this on the internet, can kind of converge too instead of polarize apart.
Yeah. I'll just add to that I think what your really good question points at is that sometimes our focus on the user experience obfuscate what's so fundamentally different from a governance and from a technical perspective. So if you take Signal, for instance, and, Telegram, right? It's sort of like a lot of the same UX at a high level. It kind of looks the same, but one is a corporation that's run in somewhat questionable ways with a lot of opaque code. I don't know what's going on inside, and I really do not agree with the governance. And, the other one is, as we said, like run by a nonprofit in an open source way. And so it's not because the user experience looks similar that you shouldn't sort of double click and think about what is the governance behind it? Where are the incentives? Is the code open source? Like what's happening on the infrastructure? And you can say the same for X and Blue Sky, right? You could open 2 pages, particularly if you have them in dark mode and say, well, that really looks the same. And in reality, it's remarkably different from a governance and from an infrastructure perspective. So I think there's also a little bit of that from a consumer perspective that's hard to grasp because again, we are, to your point, converging towards sort of similar UX, right? But we should question like, what does the underlying infrastructure look like? What does the governance look like? And we've done a remarkable job at not talking about generative AI. Congratulations to the 2 of you. But I will say those questions also carry on in very much the generative AI scene too. Anna, give us some more questions.
Yeah,
I feel a hunger for...
Okay,
and
we're going to slowly make our way across the room.
Okay. Yeah. We can take 2 and then we'll take first row. And
Hi, thank you for being here and thank you for having us. It's a pleasure. My name is Inja and I am a first-year CPA student. So my question is for Audrey. So Meta launched a brand new social media platform last year, which is Threads, and it later went viral during the 2024 election in Taiwan. And so my question is, to what extent do you think it impacted that election? And do you consider this trend as a reshaping social media movement?
That's a great question. Yeah, I may have some role in popularizing the Fediverse and Threads.net in Taiwan because I went on the record saying that TikTok is harmful product, remote controlled. So then what to do, right? And so at the time, I think Threads already made a commitment to syndicate the content, but not the social graph to the Fediverse. And so it's kind of like 50% their thing. And so, I mean, I would not endorse anything that's not open source, but I kind of shared this idea of Fediverse to the relevant public. And then there's a lot of people really looking at the TikTok issue in Taiwan, and like most public schools, I think all the private schools now banned it in the public school use. But if you're 18 years old and you use your own ISP, do whatever. But we also banned it in public sector use as well, again, because it's a remote control software. And so in Taiwan, the TikTok penetration rate just peaked at, I think, 25%. And then after that announcement, this very intentional shift, only 2%, 3%, consider that their primary application, and they just pivoted to Threads.net, and of course with Threads.net's Instagram Reels as well. And so is that a perfect term? Maybe not, but does it really help to make the conversations more back and forth, depolarizing, more bridging than the TikTok political conversations before? I would say probably yes. So that is my reflection. And also, I think Threads is a very good platform to experiment with some of those user experiences as well. So that if I post to Fediverse and I really don't like how this display is doing, I can switch to a different Mastodon instance and show people how to reply to me and so on. So there at least is a meaningful exit that way. So in that sense, I think it is a okay demonstration, although nowadays I post more on Blue Sky.
Eli, thoughts on this one?
I think that covered.
Got it. Hi. Just a quick question. My name's Yael. I'd love to talk a bit about business models when we're talking about reshaping social media. I know all three of your work have followed all of your work. This is less about some of the more interesting potential, whether it's spaces like libraries, but in a digital space, and really thinking about the big social media companies. I personally think it's too late to reel it back in and think people are going to start to pay for things when they've become very used to this all being free. And so even using Blue Sky, since you've used that example a few times today, at the end of the day, Blue Sky just did an investment round. I am concerned with the people investing in the company. They are going to have to make money eventually. So how can these companies make money but still be in the public good at the scale that we are talking about for big social media companies?
There's this whole book, well, not really book, but a long report about this, the fair data economy from Project Liberty that was just published. But I would just take a few short minutes to respond to this Blue Sky specific, because it's a very good running example, right? So one thought here is that instead of the advertisements individually precision targeting people to strip mine the social fabric, because it hides the communities, the clusters, the preference, and so on from you in the traditional social media advertise model, but then feeds you advertisement that just exemplifies the polarized part. You can think of this in a reverse way. Like if there is a sponsored content or the sponsored stream that creates a shared common experience across two different communities, bringing them together. I was just checking on Blue Sky this Swifties for Trump account, which does do some good bridging content, although somewhat one way, but they're practicing on two-way bridging as we speak. So to not to politicize that, but I think that is the idea. It could be something of a shorter bridge, like, I don't know, a cappella for science or something like that. But you can easily think about this kind of common experience that when consumed by both groups has a effect of depolarizing and bringing those two groups together without driving their internal dynamic, the bonding capital, apart. And there's a systemic way to describe this kind of thing that a lot of people in the fair data economy task force are working on. And so my conjecture, and this is not proven, is that it is possible to retain this advertisement pay or sponsored content or sponsored message pay way without strip mining the social fabric by focusing on bridging content that create shared experiences that bring the communities together. But this is not proven, which is why I'm still hacking on this algorithm.
Well, it's a great question, and I think this is actually maybe you all know the technical answer to this, but my understanding is with Blue Sky, if I wanted to create a client that was a totally different client to read the same content, I could, right? And so at that point, then the advertising part of the process becomes something that you can exit from, right? I could choose a different client that doesn't have the same advertising model as the client, as maybe like the central client. And so that's one of the reasons that I think this protocol, like it gets, I think if you think about like what is the business model of email, there isn't a business model of email. There's business models around it, and Gmail has a business model, and maybe you end up in the same place because Gmail's business model is still targeted advertising and people are willing to take that trade. But to Audrey's point, you can exit, and maybe that creates some leverage against Gmail in terms of how Gmail is going to use your data or monetize or weaponize your data. So I think I think it opens up new possibilities in terms of experimenting with business models that don't exist in a totally closed ecosystem, and that will be interesting to explore. I guess my belief is also, though, that a bunch of the costs of creating social networks have fallen by orders of magnitude, right? And so whereas when Facebook first started, you really needed billions of dollars of investment. It's like Blue Sky is 17 people, right? Like they're raising money, but they're not raising billions of dollars. They don't need to raise billions of dollars ever because running a social network is so cheap now. And so I think that also changes the game here in some interesting ways that open up possibility for new innovation.
Sorry. I would also like to say that the Proton business model, I think, is a good one because, again, had Proton been invented at the time of Gmail, that would not be possible. But again, to Li's point, because Gmail did all this research and development and all the, frankly speaking, quite good open source packages. So when Proton came around and just repackaged their, SMTP and all those PGP and encryption and so on, they did not have to invent most of these things, and therefore the operation cost is much lower.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to sort of the existing alternative business models that I think we often don't focus on that much, right? I think Blue Sky is a great example, but others that come to mind from, most commercial to least commercial is Discord is a really interesting sort of object to study. It's a very popular platform. And here their business model is actually quite different from targeted advertising, at least to date. I think of my colleague Maria Ressa, who runs a news organization. Essentially, they got fed up with having a lot of their community on Facebook and decided to build their own. And they did so using the Matrix protocol, open source technology. I think at a high level, your question's prompting us to ask, where do we have unacceptable centralization still in the hands of those large-scale social media platforms that is preventing innovation? And Audrey, you know where I'm going with that, and I promise I will go in the rabbit hole and then out of the rabbit hole so quickly. But one of the things that we focus on at IGP is safety. Because actually, when we think about it, trust and safety and the tools for online safety today remain hyper-centralized and remain, frankly, gate-kept by those large-scale Silicon Valley companies. And this we're going to need to reclaim if we want to make sure that we can unlock innovation, unlock alternative business models, and make sure that we can see sort of thriving alternative digital ecosystem. So I think that's also a question of where do we have, still highly gate-capped, unacceptable, centralized pieces of infrastructure that we need to reclaim or build alternatives to?
Can I just add one thing on that? Because I do think it's one of the things that's very cool that Blue Sky is popularizing is this idea of sort of moderation services as a layer that you could subscribe to or you could purchase in some cases. I don't think that's available yet, but I think the notion is that that if I wanted to start my own server, but I didn't want to be manually removing let's say, sexually explicit material that I didn't want on my server, I could subscribe to a service that would then do that, run that for me. And so that opens up this new sort of decentralized layer of opt-in community moderation and policing, which I think is really interesting. You can imagine some of the business model that we've thought of as all centralized inside of Facebook actually becoming this series of sort of lateral services that extend across different platforms.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Susie. I work with the Center for Countering Digital Hate as a policy manager. Something I find very frustrating about tech policy, it it feels like a very elite conversation that's kind of far removed for the average experiences of tech policy. Like if you think about healthcare, if you think about climate policy, it's very understandable to the average person. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we could change that. But then I also worry that we are ceding so much of the policy and advocacy conversation to yet another benevolent billionaire. I mean, I have a lot of respect for Project Liberty and what Frank McCourt is trying to do, but in my lifetime, we've had a lot of billionaires that turned out not to be so good for the internet. So I'm very skeptical of that. And I'd love to hear more from you folks on how we could change that.
That's a great question.
I think building protocols are fundamentally quite different from building applications. And if you're building protocols in such a way that adheres to the internet RFC process, the Internet Engineering Task Force, I mean, that is kind of the original decentralized network. And they have sort of norms to make sure that even though that many people participate in IETF sponsored by billionaire entrepreneurs and so on, they have this community that can actually cancel out a lot of those capture instincts by, for example, using sortition, using random selection when it comes to leadership and things like that. So it has a really cool governance system that sometimes we forget, but that was what bootstrapped internet as a network. And so I would say that for many billionaires looking at this space and advocating policy, I think we can think of policies that prioritizes protocol and therefore infrastructure because it's general purpose over any particular application. I think that lens is quite useful in telling whether a billionaire has their hearts in the right place.
Yeah, if I can quickly respond, I think the skepticism's fair, and that trust has to be earned is my my prayers. But I also think your point about making this connect with people's lives is really important. And I guess that's part of why, for me, with the work that we're doing at New Public, part of what I like about this local use case is it's something tactile and tangible that solves a problem for people in their daily lives, which is I need to find out what my neighbors are what's going on in our community. I need to trade information about, I have things that I need and I can help other neighbors who need things. There's just a whole bunch of like very normal everyday things that people need to do that the existing platforms actually aren't solving very well for. And that creates a space of opportunity. But I guess I feel like, so all of this is saying sort of, I think if I were to critique the space a little bit, I would say we have a lot of really brilliant ideas at a kind of like technical and policy level, and we need to be building more public interest technology driven products that solve problems for people where they don't have to care about all the like good stuff in the background. A library solves problems for people by giving them Wi-Fi or giving them books or giving them help with an application without having to care that it's part of public infrastructure or that it's part of civic democracy. And I think that's that's where we need to be looking if we really want to kind of break through.
Thank you. My name is Henry. I am a final semester senior from Williams College. And I have a question for Eli specifically, but I do want to be, before I ask this, I do want to be 100% sure. When we're talking about, taking the town square to the local level, we are talking about, in a sense, you're talking about creating like, a Twitter for individual neighborhoods, towns, correct?
Something like that, yeah.
So I have two questions with that. The first is, where do you see kind of the role, when you're working at this local level, where do you see kind of the role of the minority in all this? And just to elaborate on that, some of the first avid Twitter users I remember meeting in my life were LGBTQ kids whose families were part of our local LDS church. And they turned there because they weren't having the conversations they wanted to have locally. And so I'm curious when you're taking it down to such a local scale and you're running the risk of certain ideas, dominating the town square, and thus, or just how do you see kind of, those sort of situations playing out? And then my follow-up, because I think you could answer this in relation, is where do you also see the role of anonymity here? The same kind of anonymity is provided by social media as we have it today.
Yeah, those are great questions. I think to this question of minorities, that's very central to, like, when I think about designing technology that is supportive of democracy, that's actually kind of one of the most important. I think people imagine that that's just about sort of majority rule. Majority rule to me is not what liberal democracy anyway is about. It's about protecting the sort of dignity and agency of each person in a network. And so being attentive from the beginning to people who are going to have minority experiences or viewpoints seems like critical. And I think there are ways that you can design conversations that call that out. I think Audrey was talking about call that out, not in a critical way, but bring out the breadth of opinion and invite those opinions. So, you were talking about polis as a way of actually creating space to surface, like, what is here? What's the spectrum of belief that exists here? And inviting that into the conversation. I often think about sort of there's a story about polarization in a physical public space that I often think about, which is that human beings have an intense need. We have an intense need to sort of see ourselves as part of the in-group. And so when someone gets up and says the first statement in a debate, or if we were holding a conversation here, that person then creates a kind of like inferred or assumed in-group. And that creates a disincentive for anyone to disagree with them unless they stridently disagree, because you have to place yourself outside of that assumed in-group, and only people who stridently disagree are going to do that. And at that point, you're just incentivizing a brawl, because the person who's most likely to speak next is the person who most vehemently disagrees. That then shapes a very polarized conversation, and that's how we do conversations a lot of the time.
That sounds like my ex timeline.
Yeah. If you instead say, okay, we're going to actually form a spectrum of opinion on this, and before anyone gets to speak, we're going to understand where the bodies of opinion are in this room, then you start to have a really different kind of conversation, because you really understand sort of what that breadth looks like. And I think we're actually working on a demo. It's a very simple version, but we're working with a bunch of public media organizations on something called Comment Slider, which is literally like just that in a public conversation context. So before you get to talk, you have to sort of place yourself a little bit on a spectrum, and then you get to see where other folks are, and then you can add to it. So I think there are lots of ways that we could structure conversations that would invite more breadth of conversation. I think to your question about anonymity, I think that's really that's one of the really interestingly hard ones, and one where I think one of the questions we have is sort of pseudonymity with reputation. Like it's not just anonymity or full knowledge. I think we if you look at some highly functional subreddits, the way that works is that you have an opportunity to build a reputation without necessarily being attached to like a name and an address. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to play with those kinds of concepts that enable, because I think part of what you're speaking to is like, if I'm part of a union organizing drive, I may not want to be known from the outset as part of the union organizing drive by the boss of the drive. Like, there's very reasonable sort of power-oriented reasons why one might want to be pseudonymous. And I think we need to create affordances for that.
Audrey?
Just a point, meronym, which is partial pseudonym, partial name, is one very active research field to address this very issue, because for many online conversations, we do want to know that this person is not, say, a bot, or that for Q&A, for a maybe Mentimeter or Slido-like application here, we want to know that the person posting is actually in this room, or for many conversations, we want to know that you're beyond which age, but without learning about your birthday, or an intersection of these, so that you can know that it comes from this region, and with one of the LGBTQ related events that you have participated without disclosing exactly which you have participated, and so on. And so a interoperable protocol to disclose only the required marrow names and therefore form a group on that spectrum. I think that is one of the main things that really excites me now in the social network space, which is why I'm hacking on it.
Yeah. I'll just add to that there's a lot of really low bar, low key, hyper local experiments that everybody can run. Maybe you have a large signal chat with your friends, or WhatsApp, not to sort of like pick on the same platform, and then you can iterate on some governance rules. You can say, this is how we behave in this chat, and that's kind of a hyperlocal experiment. I can see my colleague Anya here, who has fantastic use of tech in her classroom and having a class blog. That too is an experiment. In my classroom, we have a shared Google Doc where people do weird and interesting things, and we sort of like try to figure out like, how do we take collective notes together? And I think all of these, we don't think about it this way, but they're also are ways to play with rules, are ways to play with settings, and to sort of discover and together reimagine at lower scale, more practical, small scale experiments. What is it that we want as we connect to each other in different ways online? And I encourage really everybody to sort of like embrace that playfulness of tweaking with the tools we have, right? They don't always require running distributed servers here and then, right? Yeah. I think we're taking one last question, and I think we owe it to the front row. So you get that question.
Okay, I found this absolutely a fascinating discussion. So thank you all.
I have to ask you to disclose your...
Okay, I'm Joe Stiglitz. I teach economics at Columbia. Let me first give a couple of you, and then maybe a comment from you. I really think that it is inherent in private ownership of the media that there's going to be huge distortions. The reason we have the polarization is that it is profit, and they found the best way of making profit. So while I like some of the new ideas, and they will find niches, I think that the natural inclination of the private sector is dangerous for the public, for the public good. So that necessitates thinking about alternatives, and I it's nice to think about the local level and this kind of innovation and decentralization. But as you pointed out, it's not only in person, but digital small spaces can be very brutal. And if we think about governance here in New York, you think of Tammany Hall. It wasn't the most democratic institution. So we know that there can be a lot of capture at the local level. And in my mind, the way to think about governance over this is creating lots of checks and balances, and that's some of the things that you can do on digital. And for them to really work, you have to have a lot of transparency, and the natural inclination of transparency is not the market, and so I think there needs to be regulation about transparency, but I think there needs to be regulation not only about safety, but about all the polarization, which is a social harm. Yeah. It's not only individual harm, but they're all the social harms, and that needs to be regulated. But in the end, I really think there needs to be a public option at least, and it's only through a public finance that it is a public good that you're talking about, and you only can have basically public goods that are publicly financed, and hoping that a private company would finance something that is in the public good, I think, is just wishful thinking based on a kind of neoliberalism that's been discredited over the last 40 years. So I think you ought to give up that idea and just recognize that you need a public space. Now, your worry about the First Amendment, my reading of the First Amendment, there is no clause saying that government can't regulate virality. That government can't, so you can say whatever you want, it just doesn't appear very often. And the First Amendment, I mean, it's one of the critiques of the originalists. How could they have imagined the issue of virality in 1789? So it's absurd. So the First Amendment, and Lee Bollinger, our past president, gave a very strong comment here at another event about the restrictions on free speech and that we have to create communities where we may have to have some restrictions, but in ways that keep the ability to have strong political discourse and our checks and balances. So I guess I'm just your reaction to these view of saying yes, we need the public option, we need the public infrastructure that you talk about, and we need to keep an openness. But we have to realize that the private sector will never operate in this sphere in the public interest.
And when does SEPA exercise monopoly power? That's a Q&A.
Well, I mean, I don't. I'm with you on private companies running. I mean, I guess I think there's space for something like a library or something like an Amtrak or something. That having it directly tied to a local government or to any government may be not the right structure, and that you need some measure of independence. But that I agree that there are virtues of doing things fully publicly that you don't get with other structures, and that you don't get with certainly investment-oriented startups. I think what's complicated or what's interesting is kind of, and I work a lot by analogy to the physical world, which pieces of the puzzle need to be organized in what way, right? So forgive me the metaphor, but like if you're building a library, you can hire a for-profit construction company to help you build the library, and you might tie into a network that's a kind of cooperative network to run the card catalog. There are a bunch of different infrastructures that you're pulling on to start that, and then you have this core entity that is governed in the public interest. And I guess I sort of see a bunch of those different opportunities in this space. So some of it, like what Audrey is talking about at the protocol level, is this kind of lateral infrastructure that allows you to build a governable node much more cheaply and more effectively. Some of it is going to be, the contractor that you hire, and then some of it has to be this kind of core publicly governed. You're governed in the public interest quality, and I think you need all of those pieces together, which is a project.
Audrey.
So, and I'm with you too. In Taiwan, we have this kind of digital participation infrastructure that keeps asking every year what people consider are essential services. It may change with time. For example, automated sign language interpretation was very expensive, but no longer because of AI. I finally mentioned that word tonight because of AI. And then it's now considered essential service, and therefore part of the Universal Service Fund, and therefore therefore part of the Telecommunication Act, and therefore part of the regulated like a utility kind of private sector, which is a very special kind of private sector, by the way. And so for people who provide this kind of essential services of sign language interpretation, they can recover some of the lost cost by their competitors because of the way universal access works and so on. So there are existing ways for highly regulated and or infrastructural utility private sector companies to work for the public interest if we regulate them in such a way. But this usually only works for essential services. Now, whether social media is an essential service, that is a very good conversation. But I think we can kind of separate them out at a protocol level. Like for the interoperability of the social graph and the content persistence, that's probably essential services. But for the kind of experimental advertisement platforms that are experimental way to fund content, sponsor content, maybe there's ways to innovate there as kind of private sector. But the thing is that when an experiment fails, whether the rest of the society gets to keep all the parts, or whether it just monopolizes whatever content there is, and then people are trapped, they cannot move out. Like with TikTok, there's a famous research you probably all know here last year that says if somebody, you want them to quit TikTok, if they're an average undergrad, chances are that you need to pay them a lot of money, like $50 per month. But if there's a way for everybody else to also move out, then they're willing to pay you like $30 per month. So there's a collective trap. And so how to design infrastructure such that moving out of collective trap is frictionless, or at least it was a tolerable friction. I think that is where we need to draw this protocol infrastructure and application line.
Oh, no, I fully agree. I fully agree. I'm French, so I do think that like regulation is fundamental. I will say, I think the reason why we're sort of so deep in the details, like it's an interesting time in America to think that the government should be in charge of regulating and funding social media. And so I think this is what we're all sort of working through, right? Like, how do we do this with sort of like the depth of understanding which layers of the stack should be encouraged in which way? How do we make innovation possible again in this field? Because I think a lot of what we're talking about is, a very high barrier to innovation in social media. And I think what you're both are saying is, how do we seize the momentum that we have now for a wide variety of reasons? Some of them technical. You talked about lowering the barriers to making a social network. Some of them political. It's also a moment where people are saying like, hey, you know what? I think I could do without X. And I think what you both illustrated in this conversation is that we are reaching a moment of optimism and a moment of alternative futures being back on the table, I think, in a way that they haven't been in a few years. And so I hope that this conversation and our event today was an invitation to you all to look at your own online space, social online spaces around you, to look into the work that Audrey is doing, that Eli is doing, and to sort of like reinvent how we connect to each other online in small and big ways, and to start questioning, sort of peeling the layers of the onion. I am not saying you should go and study the stack of every single thing that runs on your phone, but if you can start engaging and thinking, hey, I use this tool a lot. What do I know about this governance? Or, hey, these are two apps that look really much the same. Is one open source, and what does it mean? What are the stacks that are governing all those tools that we use, and how do we invent new rules for how we communicate and create those local and hyper-local spaces? So thank you so much, Audrey. Thank you so much, Eli, for inviting us in all these possible futures.
Thank you.
I just want to make two comments on as we close. The first is the real joy of working in a university is you get to imagine who you want to put into conversation and make it happen. This is something I was really excited for, and it paid all sorts of dividends. Thank you again. Really grateful, and we have an upcoming conversation that will pick up parts of tonight's conversation, which is to think about what kind of infrastructure for public participation can be put into place. So it will not be in person, it will be a digital event, and you can find it on our website, but it will be featuring on December 5th with Anoush Touranian, the Deputy Mayor of Paris, who is leading a citizen assembly process, alongside Peggy Flynn, the manager for the city of Petaluma, who's also launching a citizens assembly process here in the US. So we're going to move from thinking about the virtual to what it means to come together in person and deliberate and argue and actually put forward ideas that can be borne out in policy. So hope you all join us. Thanks very much.